Hello everyone and welcome to the Eddie Proudfoot podcast. Today on our 6th episode, we're going to talk about weapons and how to use them in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you turn to page 149 of the Player's Handbook, you'll see a large table on that page that lists out all the weapons available to you from the PHB. So what are these weapons and how do I use them? Well, there are 4 different subcategories on this table that you may see, and really there are 2 types of weapons and 2 classes of weapons. So the classes are simple and martial, which will matter when your class tells you which weapons you have proficiency in. Sometimes it lists off individual weapons, but other times it'll just say simple weapons or martial weapons, and you'll be proficient with all the ones in those categories. You might notice, though, each of the simple and martial categories have 2 components to them, melee and ranged. When you shoot a ranged weapon, you will be adding your dex modifier to the attack roll. When you attack with a melee weapon, you will add your strength modifier. That is the main difference between these 2 types of weapons. As a result, you may notice in this column on the far right that says properties, there are these things called ranges, and they're in parentheses next to 2 particular words, either ammunition or thrown. We'll talk about what ammunition and thrown mean later on, but the range is telling you how far you can shoot the weapon. Melee, it's very simple. The creature or object you're trying to attack needs to be within 5 feet of you. If you are 5 feet or further away, then you cannot use a melee weapon. You can use a ranged weapon. You can shoot a ranged weapon without being disadvantaged in the range of 5 to whatever the first number that appears after range is. So for the example of a light crossbow, it has 80-320 as the range. That's saying from 5 to 80 feet, you can shoot the crossbow at something, no problem. But you can also shoot the crossbow up to 320 feet, but if it's 80 to 320 feet, you're disadvantaged. Similarly, if you try and use a ranged weapon in close combat, so that 0 to 5 foot range for melee weapons, you will also be disadvantaged. So there is that sweet spot in the middle. You don't want to be too close and you don't want to be too far. You want it to be just right. So that's melee and ranged. Now, when you attack with either of these weapons, as we talked about in a previous episode on attack rolls, you're going to either add the dex or strength mod, if it's melee or ranged, we now know, and you add your proficiency if you're proficient with the weapon. Then you sum all that together and tell your DM what number you got. They will compare that against the thing you're trying to hit's armor class, its AC that we talked about in the last episode. If you meet or beat that number, then you hit. And when you hit, you deal damage. Every weapon has a damage roll associated with it. And this is written out something like 1d4 bludgeoning or 2d6 slashing. What that means is this is the number of dice you roll, this is the type of dice you roll, and this is the type of damage you deal. You also get to add the modifier that you used for the attack roll. So if it was a ranged weapon, you add your dex mod to the damage as well. If it was a melee weapon, you add your strength mod to the damage as well. You do not, however, add your proficiency bonus. And then the DM will make a note of how much damage the creature or whatever object you were trying to hit took. Next, we're going to discuss properties. There are 11 properties total that weapons can have, but because some have to do with rules that we're not going to cover today, we're only going to talk about 4 more, and that is finesse, thrown, versatile, and two-handed. Two-handed simply means you need 2 hands to swing the weapon. If you cannot hold it with 2 hands, you cannot use it. Every other weapon that doesn't say this is assumed to be one-handed. Versatile, which means you can swing the weapon two-handed, and if you do, next to versatile, there is a new damage die. That'll be how much damage you deal when you swing two-handed. So in the case of a battle axe, it's normally 1d8 slashing, but if you swing it with 2 hands, it's 1d10 slashing. The damage type does not change. Thrown and ammunition are the 2 properties that you have whenever there is a ranged weapon. So ranged weapons will either need ammunition or you're simply throwing the weapon, in which case the ammunition is the weapon. We'll discuss ammunition and the other properties in later episodes after we understand more about the rules of combat. What thrown means, though, is that you add your strength modifier when you throw the weapon. Finally, there is finesse. If a weapon has the finesse property, it means that when you make a melee attack with that weapon, you can choose to use your dexterity modifier over your strength modifier. If a weapon is both thrown and finesse, you can also use your dexterity modifier when throwing the weapon. Okay, that's all I wanted to talk about with regards to weapons today. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Eddie Proudfoot podcast. If you enjoyed it, please follow us on Instagram, Spotify, or Twitter. And as always, may the gods have mercy on your soul.